All right, let's go ahead and get started. And as people hop on, they can just catch up. But we have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. First of all, thank you all for joining today's call. This call is the third in a four-part series designed to discuss Prosperity Now's 2021 policy priorities with the Prosperity Now community, as well as other network partners. We also want to talk about what these policies would mean for your community, and then most importantly, hear from you all on what you're working on either at the state or municipal level, and talk about what we can do to move these policies forward. As you can see, today's webinar, today's call, today's discussion will focus on our affordable home ownership priorities. And I am Vanna Kier. I'm the Associate Director for Advocacy here at Prosperity Now. So as you can see here, last week we discussed our financial security priorities. The week before that, the first discussion we had was around our tax priorities. If you missed either of those calls, we will drop a link into the chat where you can catch up and see what was discussed on those calls. But like I mentioned, today is focused on affordable home ownership, which you'll hear in a few minutes. And then not next week, 2 weeks from today, focus on our consumer protections priorities. Before we begin, I want to go over a couple housekeeping items for you all. I know that some people are not too familiar with Microsoft Teams, so just want to make sure you all know where everything is. All participants should be in listen-only mode, just to ensure that sound quality is there. The webinar is being recorded. Like I said, the last two have been recorded. And this recording, along with the others, will be shared at the end of this webinar series. So we'll send out an email with all of recordings to all of these webinars on them so that you all will have them if you'd like to share. We want this call to be as interactive as possible. So we'll be taking questions throughout today's presentation. Ask a question or drop a comment into the chat box just to get the conversation going. You can see here on the screen, this icon is for the chat box. You can raise your hand. We'll call on you to speak up, to unmute yourself, and to ask a question. But again, we really want this to feel like two-way dialogue, not just us presenting our priorities at you. We'd like for you to chime in and let us know what you think about some of these policies and how they relate to your community or some of the work that you're doing in your state. So please don't hesitate to speak up. And we're also going to share additional resources throughout the call in the chat box. So just be on the lookout for that. And if you all have resources that you find helpful in your community, feel free to drop them in the chat box as well. And then lastly, if you're not following Prosperity Now on Twitter, I would encourage you to do so. That's our Twitter handle there on the screen for you. So feel free to follow us on Twitter. And in just a few minutes here, I will kick it over to these folks. But joining us for today's call is Pam Agava, our Program Manager for Affordable Home Ownership at Prosperity Now, Anju Chopra, who's our Senior Policy Manager at Prosperity Now, myself, and then Doug Ryan, who's our Senior Fellow and Policy Director here at Prosperity Now. And before I kick it over to Anju, want to go over today's agenda. Pretty simple here, same format that we used for all of these calls. After my welcome, Anju will open us up in talking about our 2021 affordable home ownership priorities. Following Anju, Pam and Doug chiming in about these priorities, we'll open it up for discussion and Q&A. But like I said, we want to have sort of discussion throughout today's presentation. So feel free to drop questions, comments into the comments box, and we will we'll have that engagement going as well. And then we'll wrap up in talking about next steps and how to get involved. So with that, Anju, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Vanna. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. As Vanna mentioned, my name is Anju Chopra. I'm a Senior Policy Manager at Prosperity Now, and I'm here to talk about one of our main housing policy priorities for 2021, the Housing Pathways proposal. Vanna, you can go to the next slide. This was one of our core priorities last year as well. With the results of the November election, we think we have a better chance of advancing this proposal over the next few years. It's a four-part proposal that reduces housing cost burdens at points when people are making critical house choices. It is particularly for low-income families and households of color, though not exclusively. The last piece of the proposal is available to people with higher incomes as well. So why is there a need for a proposal like this? As you can see from this slide, Americans are significantly housing cost burdened. Being house cost burdened is defined as when a family spends 30% or more of their income on housing. According to the Joint Center on Housing Studies, between 1960 and 2016, median rent went up approximately 61%, while renter income only increased by about 5%. Similar patterns exist for homeowners. While home values rose by about 112%, incomes only increased by about half that amount during the same time frame. Next slide. Not surprisingly, low-income families and households of color are particularly burdened. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Worst Case Housing Needs Report, families with worst case needs grew by approximately 66% between 2001 and 2015. This is defined as households at 50% of area median income or less, who spent more than 50% of income on rent, who live in severely inadequate conditions, or both. And in terms of households of color, housing cost burdens are about 10 percentage points higher than white households, which you can see from the graph on the right. Next slide. So our proposal would replace the upside down mortgage interest and property tax deductions. When we refer to these deductions as upside down, we're talking about programs that benefit the wealthy few at the top and do next to nothing for those with the greatest needs. They would be replaced with a set of tax credits and matched savings programs that are more inclusive and equitable. Specifically, as I mentioned at the beginning, the proposal has 4 parts and helps alleviate housing cost burdens at various stages, from renting to saving up for home purchase, to then dealing with near and long-term costs associated with homeownership. The 4 pieces are the low-income renters credit, the down payment builder match savings program, the first-time homeowners credit, and the homeowners post-purchase tax credit. The renter's credit alleviates rental cost burdens to help save for other expenses, including home purchase. The match savings program helps us save up for home purchase closing costs. The first-time homeowners credit reduces the financial strains created by purchasing a home. And the post-purchase credit helps with ongoing ownership costs like repairs. Taken together, it adds up to a lifetime of housing cost relief. Each piece alone has impact, but we feel that the strength of this proposal is that it's a comprehensive package of policies that can work together to create the greatest relief. And it takes into consideration that people face different cost burdens at different times. More specifically, the low-income renters credit is for households who make 80% or less of area median income and at the same time spend approximately 30% or more of their paycheck on rent. The credit would be used for, between $1,000 and $3,000 and would gradually phase up based on the level of cost burden. It's also refundable, which means filers with no tax liability could take the full credit. The down payment builder match savings program is also for 80% AMI households or less. A participant could save up to a maximum of $2,000 of their own money over a 2-year period, and whatever they save could be matched 1-to-1 by the federal government, meaning they could walk away with a maximum of $4,000 overall. The first-time homeowners tax credit is also for households at 80% AMI or less, and the most that can be taken is $6,000. It would be limited to 5% of the purchase price for homes valued at $60,000 or less to prevent a windfall for less expensive homes. And it would only be available once during the tax filing season that immediately follows home purchase. Last but not least, there's the homeowner's post-purchase tax credit. Unlike the other three recommendations, this is available to all tax filers, not just low-income households, to provide some tax relief to those that could no longer take the mortgage interest or the property tax deduction. It would be a flat credit of approximately $1,200 available annually, meaning a household on the low end of the income spectrum would get the same amount as someone who's wealthier. So for example, taking the whole proposal overall, say you have a household, we'll call them the Lopez family. They're low income and they're extremely housing cost burdened. They're currently renting, but have dreams of becoming a homeowner one day. So the first piece of the proposal would help them save additional money during renting that could help them save up for home purchase costs, but it could also give them flexibility to save for other things. The second piece would accelerate the process of saving up for home purchase closing costs, getting Lopez family into a home sooner. The third piece would alleviate the acute financial strains that the family could experience after spending so much money on such a large purchase. And the final piece would help them maintain their home and decrease the likelihood of foreclosure or home depreciation. So that's the Housing Pathways proposal. If you have thoughts about the proposal, including members of Congress you think might be interested in sponsoring the bill, we'd love to get your feedback. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Anju. And before I turn over to Pam, I wanted to see if anyone had any questions, any comments about what you've heard about the Housing Pathways proposal. Feel free to slip them into the chat box or raise your hand and I will unmute you, but wanted to open up the floor before we turn over to Pam to see what questions or comments there were. Okay, I will let you all continue to chew on or mull over what you've heard from Anju, and we'll open it up for questions and discussion again at the end.
Vanna, it looks like Shira had a question in the chat.
Yes. I see your question, Shira. To clarify, is this all in one bill? Anju, I will let you answer that.
Yeah, so we are proposing it as one bill, but we feel that taken together, it's the most transformative. But we have had situations like when we had an opportunity to introduce it in the House last year, and we actually had two separate members of Congress that were going to jointly introduce it. One was going to introduce two pieces of it, and the other was going to introduce the other two pieces of it. So you can introduce single pieces on your own, and that can have an impact. And we're not opposed to that. We think, even one element would be worth advancing, but we present it as a proposal altogether because we think that that has the most impact, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that question. And I didn't see it at first because my chat box wasn't highlighting as things are coming in. But another question here from Nia is, any consideration or where or if the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act renovation credit fits in this pathway?
This is Doug. I can answer that if you want me to. Since I've been working on with our partners in the housing space for a while on that we are original, organizational sponsor of that bill. It is really bipartisan at this point, both in the House and the Senate, and we're excited about that. That for now is a standalone bill outside the Pathways proposal and outside the components of the Pathways proposal. Now, with Congress, any bill is unlikely to become law as a standalone measure. So that will likely be packaged with other things, perhaps the infrastructure bill. All these things are such a moving target. So after the COVID relief package is settled, we're going to move on to other legislation, and the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act will be part of that conversation, as will, we hope, the pathways that Anju discussed. So that's kind of on a separate track, but that had bipartisan support in the last Congress, It has bipartisan support in this Congress, and we're excited to be behind that as well. And that's a very important tool for rebuilding home ownership and bringing wealth back to communities. So thank you for that question.
Thanks, Doug. And if you all have any other questions, we'll circle back after we move along and hear from Pam in a moment. So continue the dialogue in the chat, and I'll answer some more questions towards the end of today's call. So Pam, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Vanna. So today I will be talking about expanding CDFI capacity. As Anji mentioned, the Pathways to Homeownership proposal has multi-pronged aspects to it, but one of the biggest things is getting dollars down to the ground. And for us, we believe that CDFIs would be the perfect opportunity to do that. And to increase CDFI capacity, we really have to look at the policies regulating capital there. And even though CDFIs access capital through various means outside of the CDFI fund, for most of the CDFIs, the fund is its primary source. And so today we focused on just a couple of ways that we can expand CDFI capacity and hopefully increase dollars on the ground towards affordable home ownership goals. Next slide, Vanna. So the approach we're taking is really looking at CDFIs as a primary institution of the financial market for low-income households and particularly households of color. And so in thinking about that, CDFIs have a unique position to address structural barriers that prevent households from achieving home ownership and achieving financial prosperity. And so two small recommendations that we have to increase capitalization for CDFIs is simply increasing capitalization of the CDFI fund as a whole. And so the first point is to adjust the funding cap to 10 million. This is just a minimum suggestion, but focusing particularly on rural and persistent poverty areas. There are many ways to kind of break this down, but first moving the cap up would allow CDFIs to take on more capital, particularly when we're talking about affordable housing development. And in rural and persistent poverty areas, we know that that capital will be able to be put to use much more effectively in larger amounts rather than trying to piecemeal money down the pipeline. We also recommend that Congress should appropriate funding for the CDFI secondary market program, and this funding should be over and above appropriations that have historically been provided to CDFIs through its existing programs. So this would be another opportunity to increase capital into the market and expand opportunity and access for home ownership for many households that are not able to access it through traditional banking means. And so we think that this is another way of increasing capitalization that would benefit home ownership for all populations. And so with that, I'm going to transfer it over to Doug to talk about some of our manufactured housing policy goals.
Great, thank you, Pam. And a couple of things, the graphic didn't show up here, but that's okay. Anyway, a couple of things. One thing that I want to just piggyback on what Pam said about the CDFI ideas is that many of them are already authorized or had been authorized in the 1994 Regal Act, which created the CDFI fund and the CDFI program. For example, the secondary market, technical assistance and capacity building, these things that we're all interested in. So this isn't actually this isn't even about re-envisioning the CDFI program. It's actually going back to its origins and being true to the legislation. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and there shouldn't be legislative resistance to this because this stuff is already part of the legislative history and the package of the CDFI fund. So I just want to build that out. And then quickly, then we're going to go to questions. I just have a couple points. As many of you know, and many on this call have participated in the Innovations in Manufactured Home program, which we have run since 2005. There are some opportunities in the current Congress and administration to build off all the successes that we've had in that space. So one is the Manufactured Housing Community Preservation Act, a bill that was introduced last Congress by Representative Axtey of Iowa and Representative Khanna of California. And it is basically a grant program that requires a match that will help preserve communities that are committed to retaining affordability, retaining modest limits on rent increases, and retaining the property as a community, all of which are at risk in the current fiscal environment. So in essence, this would be a housing preservation program. And it became part of the infrastructure package that the Democrats passed in the House last Congress. And we are optimistic that it'll be part of the conversation in this Congress as well. We are looking for bipartisan support. We think we'll get there. And there's lots of good partners across the country and in districts across the country to make that happen. So we're hopeful for that, and we'll keep everybody in the loop, and obviously reach out to us if you have interest or questions about this. The next slide, please. One of our most successful components of the Home program over the years was that in late 2019, Congress enacted and the president signed the HUD Manufactured Housing Modernization Act. A little weedy, but in essence, what it does for communities and states that receive federal HUD dollars, for example, CDBG, home, et cetera, they have to do a consolidated plan, right, to determine how they're going to use those dollars. But this law requires HUD to provide guidance to those recipients, those federal dollars recipients, to assess the value and the place of manufactured housing in their housing plans. It doesn't require that you use those dollars to fund manufactured housing or preservation or what have you, but you have to look at it and consider that this sector is part of the housing ecosystem. And we think that this will raise the profile and also, frankly, offer tools, lower cost tools for affordable home ownership that many localities and states have not considered, in part because of their zoning restrictions, because of the stigma, and frankly, ignorance of the space. So again, we're proud that this bipartisan piece of legislation became law in late 2019. We are very disappointed that the last administration failed to begin rulemaking, but we're confident the next HUD will. So again, we're looking forward to that. And the next one, next slide, please. And finally, one of the biggest challenges in the manufactured homes space is single family finance. Now, what we're hoping to get the attention of the administration, both at HUD and FHA, USDA and its rural housing programs, as well as the VA and its lending programs, is get them focused and committed to expanding the existing pilots for manufactured housing that exist at USDA under the 502 program, which is really a perfect match for rural manufactured home buyers. And we want to make that permanent and also expand how it's used and the applicability of it. But we also want to get FHA through both its Title I program, which funds personal property loans, and the Title II program, which is the traditional mortgage. We want them to focus on manufactured housing as a tool and expand its use in those programs. And then finally, while the VA program does a pretty good job with manufactured homes, and a lot of veterans are disproportionate owners of manufactured housing, we'd like to see the VA do more as well. As a note, this is a really tiny share of the government lending portfolio. It really does not reflect the use of it on the ground in the real world. But we're looking forward to the opportunity to have conversations with the administration and with Congress about making these initiatives take flight in the next year. So again, those are a quick summary of some of the highlights of the program. Please reach out with any questions, and thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Doug. And I know that this has been touched on kind of throughout our three speakers and their talking points. Anju, Pam, and Doug have all touched on it, but I think one of the goals that we have for these priorities, as well as some of our other priorities and some of our other issue areas, is introduction. I know that Doug mentioned the Manufactured Housing Community Preservation Act will be introduced, but that's the goal for our Housing Pathways proposal this year, is to get the bill introduced. We're currently shopping it right now to see who our potential sponsors could be in Congress. And then the goal is just to get as many co-sponsors as possible in both chambers to build up some momentum for possible passage this Congress. So would really appreciate your help, everyone on the call, and helping us, if there are members of Congress in your state that you think would be good co-sponsors or would be interested in taking the lead on some of those issues, we would really appreciate that feedback. And so now I want to move us along to the discussion piece of today's call and get some, hear from you all. Like I mentioned at the top of the call, is one of the goals is just to get some feedback from you, your thoughts on, what you've heard and what's happening in your states. So I have 4 discussion questions here that I want to propose, and I want you all to offer up some feedback. So the first being, do any of these policies align with your own priorities there in your state and in the work that you're doing? What housing related policies are you prioritizing in your state? The third being, what resources or supports do you need from Prosperity Now on your own housing related advocacy? And then how would you like to continue to engage with us on affordable homeownership related advocacy? So as these issues progress, as they move forward, how would you like to be kept up to date on these? Are these types of calls helpful, these sort of strategy calls? Or would you prefer email updates or our online tracker that I'll talk about here in a few minutes? But just wanting to hear from you what would be most helpful in terms of keeping you abreast of these issues. So I want to spend as many minutes as possible just hearing from you all on these 4 questions and also answering any questions that you had earlier. And Anju, I think there was a question earlier about the Housing Pathways proposal, and I'll let you answer it. It was any sense of the opportunity for bipartisan support for the proposal?
Yeah, I actually think that there is a chance for that. I think one of the interesting things about housing is that there are places in this country where things are very unaffordable, and so there is an interest in those markets, even among some moderate Republicans, to ease some of the burden among their constituents. There are also Republicans that are not too keen on the mortgage interest deduction and the property tax deduction. When you look and you sort of look at from the Capitol Hill sightline, there are Republicans who feel that the deductions, aside from the inequity issues, are simply inefficient ways to spend tax dollars. And so there is an opportunity for bipartisanship. Now, with that said, these are more Democrat-friendly proposals overall, but we do have some hope that there are Republicans out there that might be interested in pursuing the pieces of this proposal.
Thanks, Anju. And I see a question here. What types of changes are being considered to the Section 502 loan? Doug, if you want to hop back on and answer
Sure,
that.
thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, legislatively, there's nothing that I'm aware of to changing the 502 program. That said, the USDA and rural housing has a lot of authority to pilot programs and pilot initiatives. For example, targeting certain parts of rural America for mortgages and that kind of thing. So the 2 pilots that they launched in the manufactured housing space were to fund energy efficient homes in resident-owned communities. So it's a kind of a niche, but it has happened in Vermont, and we're excited that this is going to happen elsewhere in the country. And that basically, again, Congress has given the authority to USDA to have that kind of flexibility. The second one is to refinance existing homes that had not been previously financed by the 502 program, which under current program rules, that was prohibited. Basically, you could only refinance with a 502 you could only purchase a 502 financed home with a 502 mortgage if it was originally financed that way. So the USDA has authority to move the needle on some of these things, and that's the conversation we want to have. But if you have ideas on legislation, we'd definitely welcome them. And I want to add one final point on this, is that, and this really can't be left unsaid, is that earmarks, the appropriation process that includes specific state or district projects, they're back in this Congress, and that's pretty important to help move the needle on pilots, on program priorities, and things like that. So there's a lot of opportunity here, but again, we'd welcome any ideas that the audience has.
Thank you, Doug. And I see a question here from Rachel, also curious, have you engaged mayors and CEOs for affordable housing at all on any of these proposals? And Rachel, are you speaking about, let me see, I haven't clicked this this link that you linked here. Rachel, would you mind unmuting yourself just to say more? Because I'm not sure if you're talking about our proposals or some proposals that you've linked here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so this group is, I'm with Kaiser Permanente, and we're a part of Mayors and CEOs for U.S. housing investment, and it's basically a bipartisan group of mayors and CEOs who are bringing sort of advocacy platforms to the federal level. And so I'm just curious if you all have engaged with them at all, and I may be able to make an introduction if you'd be interested in meeting them and seeing if any of the proposals that you discussed today would be of interest to them and their platform.
Thank you for raising that, and I will defer to Doug. And I don't think we have engaged with this group, but I'll defer to Doug to say more.
Yeah, we'd welcome the opportunity to do that. I know our colleague Holden Weissman has worked with the Conference of Mayors and others, perhaps the legal cities, or he's presented to them, and we would welcome the opportunity to talk specifically with them about these things. So an introduction would be more than welcome. There are definitely some cities across the country that would be interested in these things. And of course, we'd also like to talk to them about zoning, which is also often a challenge to affordable housing, affordable home ownership. So yeah, anything that's on the table, we appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much for offering.
Thanks, Rachel. Another question here. Do you know if the USDA pilot has been successful in Vermont? In parentheses, where many homes were financed.
Yeah, success is a low bar. It's been fun. Homes have been funded in Vermont through the 502 pilot program. We would have liked to see more and more widespread. And also the USDA office that operates in Vermont also operates in New Hampshire. So we would like to see more funding across state line, across the Connecticut River into New Hampshire. But that's kind of where we are. We really need to get other states to get off the ground as well. There's been some interest in Oregon and California and elsewhere, but that's the challenge where we are. There's some other kind of regulatory stuff that we're trying to get over. I wouldn't necessarily call it a success, but I think we're making progress.
Thanks, Doug. A couple other questions are coming in. I'm going to try to read them off as quickly as possible. Question here, is any concern being raised at Fannie Mae with the amount of virtually free money they are handing investment groups to buy parks at 2 or more times their value? They then up the rents based on the price they pay for the park.
Are there any concerns? Yes, there are a whole heck of a lot of concerns. That's why we think that the Preservation Act would do some good. It would be another source of capital, free capital for preservation projects across the country. Now, Fannie and Freddie will argue that they do these kinds of deals in order to fund the rest of their operations, including their affordable housing goals and their duty to serve obligations. That said, we have been concerned about this, and there's a lot. It's pretty complicated, but at the end of the day, we think this needs to be embedded in their affordable housing strategy, and that they should, in large ways, do no harm. Now, that said, the new rules that are out, the new multifamily lending guidance from their regulator, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which were released at the end of last year, maybe November. I can't recall, but within the last 6 months, that guidance on multifamily lending, which is what parks are included in, will actually move what the questioner is asking. Will actually move in that direction. So we're optimistic about that to a point, but we really need to see that have some teeth on it, and we'd love to see Congress take a look at that, because I think everybody wants to get to the same place. But there are some regulatory tools that I think that we could use to get there a little faster and do less harm to residents across the country. But thank you for that question. I think there's some progress, though.
All right, and another question here, and then I also want you all to chime in on some of the discussion questions that we asked, particularly number 2. I think that is always helpful for a group like this to hear what advocates in other states are working on at the state and local level. So if you all are doing some housing work around some of the things that we have mentioned or other things, would love to hear from you on what that work is. But a question here, Meredith, I see you're asking, I joined late, so I may have missed, but curious if Prosperity Now is doing any work on those bipartisan inclusive zoning proposals. And Doug, I'm going to have you just continue to unmute yourself every time I ask a question.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff on zoning that we're doing. In fact, I mean, we know from our history of the development of the American city and then later the development of the American suburb, how integrated, for lack of a better term, zoning, single family zoning that now covers about 75% of all residential land in the country was an intentional tool to foment racial segregation. So with that backdrop, we actually have to be really aggressive in challenging that. I mean, in cities like Minneapolis and Sacramento, the state of Oregon have moved in that direction to do the right thing, in my view, to reduce zoning barriers. Now, the challenge there is that does not create home ownership or housing opportunities overnight, because that doesn't mean that people are just going to step in there and build. But we have to start, learning from these examples and going forward. And we would love to continue to have the conversation with mayors, planning agencies, state legislators, and others that are willing to take that step, which, by the way, is very politically risky, right? We all know that. A lot of homeowners who might be on your side and lots of other issues, they draw the line here, and they do that where I live, and they do that where lots of other people on this call live as well. And I think we need to be aware of that, and we have to, kind of show how this is for the greater good and move forward. But that's a really great question. Zoning is fundamentally to the core of the housing crises that we face in many cities across the country.
Thanks, Doug. And then I think it's pronounced Bio from Casa of Oregon. I see that you were sharing some of the work that you're doing in Oregon. Would love it if you would unmute yourself to say more about this legislation.
Sure. Yes, you got my name right. Nice work. Right, yes, Bio Casa of Oregon, that's Community and Shelter Assistance of Oregon. We have currently an opportunity to purchase legislation, and we have found that while it is better than not having the legislation, it's not really strong enough to level the playing field. So there aren't enough sticks or carrots, it would seem. So at first we were going to push for right of first refusal, but we found that to be too difficult at this time. Like it just wasn't going to go through. And I think we still might, by we meaning CASA and others in the state, still might push for right of first refusal with the knowledge that it will not go through, and then say, well, if we can't get that, then how about we strengthen the opportunity to purchase? So it's going to be one of those two, but at the end of the day, I think we believe that we can end up strengthening opportunity to purchase. Is that good, Vanna? Or?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to hear more from you about what the legislation was. I saw it drop there, and I don't know much about it, so I wanted to hear more about what it is.
Do you want me to explain a little bit more about what opportunity to purchase is?
Yes,
okay,
just in case folks from other states are doing it.
Right, yeah, I didn't think of that. Yeah, sure. So opportunity to purchase is legislation that in our state, if a manufactured home community goes up for sale, it gives the residents an opportunity, or it's designed to, or it's intended to give them a realistic opportunity to organize themselves to collectively purchase and operate the community as a resident-owned community, as a ROC. So we are a certified technical assistance provider for ROC USA in Oregon. And in the legislation, the owner who is selling the property is supposed to tell the residents that it's up for sale, and that would trigger either us or the state reaching out to us to reach out in turn to the residents to help them organize and get the proper financing and develop a nonprofit corporation to purchase the land. And we found that, and also there's the belief that the owners will negotiate in good faith. So if they get a comparable offer to what the residents are offering, or if the residents are offering if the residents have an offer that's comparable to what another private investor is offering, they'll go with the residents is the idea. But some have been using the residents offer just to bump up the offer of the investor, and because the investors have more liquidity, so they can just leverage and mobilize their dollars a lot quicker than what the residents can. And so that's one issue. And the other issue is if they don't tell the residents in the time that the law dictates, or at all, there really isn't much of like the carrot or the stick that we have, which I can't remember what it is, but it's not sufficient to discourage that type of practice. And also, I think there's some kind of tax credit that you get if you sell to the residents, but it only those businesses who are in Oregon-based businesses have the opportunity to take advantage of that. And some of these, large firms aren't Oregon-based. So we wanted to do the right of first refusal, which would compel the owners to sell to the residents if the offer is the same. They would have to sell it to them. I know Paul Bradley's on this call, so he probably knows a little bit more about this than me. So if he wants to jump in, he can. But right of first refusal compels them to sell to the residents if the offers are the same, and that's a big push, and one that we, like I said, we don't anticipate getting through.
Gotcha. Thank you, Bio. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Leo.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
To make connections on these type of calls in case people in other states are thinking about similar legislation. I know that we supported something similar at the federal level the last Congress or two. So Paul or Doug, I see your faces are now visible on my screen. I don't know if either of you were going to say something, but I'll turn it over to you.
I just want to say something quick. I would love to, I just posted in the chat the new resource guide that we published on the right to purchase, the purchase opportunity across the country. So take a look at that, everybody, if you're interested. But I also want to make sure that for the other topics that we've been covering on this call, that we have an opportunity to address those too, Vanna. So I'm happy to answer whatever people want in this space, but I also want to be aware that we have about 15, 16 minutes left, and I want to be, cognizant of people's time. So I just want to put it out there, and I can stop talking, but.
Thanks, Doug. To Doug's point, if anyone has any other comments, questions, similar things that you're working on, particularly as it relates to the housing pathways proposal that we talked about earlier, any of those sort of 4 buckets that you all may be working on at the state or local level, would love to hear about that, but just trying to get a sense of what you all are doing, how these priorities align with your own. And then to the third point in our discussion questions, if there's any supports that Prosperity Now can offer to you all, would love to hear that. So I'll pause for another second to see what else comes up. Meredith, I see that you would like to chime in on your federal policy priorities. Would love to hear them from results.
Great. Yeah, I know you'd asked more specifically about state, but results just focuses on federal policy, federal anti-poverty policy measures. But in particular, we're kind of primarily been more focused on low-income renters, and a lot kind of in the context of in the pandemic, preventing a big spike in evictions and emergency rental and utility assistance. Looking ahead, we're also putting more of a focus on expanding federal assistance for low-income renters. But I think there's a lot of ways that overlaps, in particular with the renters credit proposal that is part of the pathways. the map you had earlier. Part of that is kind of trying to understand what might be on the table in terms of other measures. I think the president had a renter's credit proposal that was kind of designed to layer on top of kind of for folks, making housing choice vouchers universal and then layering a renter's credit on for folks who still would struggle with affordability but might not be eligible for federal housing assistance. I think that's my understanding. I haven't circled back to that in a while because of what's been happening with COVID relief legislation. But so that's a place in particular where I think I know we have some interest, and I think others do too, where it would overlap with issues that you all are prioritizing. And, I think longer term, this is just helpful because I know a number of folks in our grassroots network are also really interested in home ownership policies. So seeing some of the other pieces is helpful to understand some of the other, how the renter's credit could fit in with other proposals.
Yeah, this is Andre. I just wanted to quickly chime in that I think our housing pathways proposal, along with other policies that we are supporting, I think is particularly important in the era of COVID because people are going to need to recover. And I think that housing was definitely impacted by COVID. So policies that actually provide some additional relief, particularly during moments of acute strain, have particular importance.
Thank you, Anju. And just along the lines of COVID relief, I see Russ has a question here. Is there anything to address the disaster that awaits when the eviction moratoriums expire?
I would just quickly say, I do know that there's a relief package right now, a recovery package, I should say, that is supposed to be coming up after the current stimulus is done being discussed in Congress and finally passed, whatever that version is. And hopefully they will be addressing that very issue in that recovery bill.
Any other questions or things that you all are working on that you'd like to share, supports that you need? Any thoughts on how to continue to engage on our housing priorities? And thank you, Meredith. I see that, Meredith, you just put some additional notes there about the COVID relief package. So hearing nothing, I will move us along to talk a little bit about next steps and what you all can do. And I see that, Bio, you chimed in again and said that Oregon is working on bolstering the individual development accounts match savings program. We actually talked about that a little bit last week. I forget who was on from Oregon to discuss that. Someone from Neighborhood Partnerships there was on to talk more about your IDA work there in Oregon. So thank you for bringing that up again. So I'll move us along to talk next steps. And if you all have any additional questions or comments, feel free to drop them into the chat box. But wanted to make you all aware of this tool on Prosperity Now's website, our federal policy tracker. As these particular issues start to be hopefully introduced in Congress in the coming months, we'll update our federal policy tracker on our website, a place that you can go and just quickly see the status of these pieces of legislation as they're moving. It'll auto update as things move to committee, as it's passed, but it is on our federal policy page on our Prosperity Now website. So definitely feel free to take a look at that as things begin to move. And then secondly, want to plug our Prosperity Now Advocacy Center for you all. Of course, you all know, being in our network, as these issues start to move and as they're introduced, we'll send out emails to let you all know what's happening with these issues, let you know what you can do to help us drum up support for them. But we do all of that through our Prosperity Now Advocacy Center, and I invite you all to join it if you're not already a member of it. Just a one-stop shop for engaging your members of Congress. And then something that I didn't plug a slide for in this call today, but I did want to make you all aware of, is that our Prosperity Now scorecard, which is our data set that we release every year, we just released new state cost of living profiles in the spirit of homeownership and housing. Wanted to let you all know that those that profiles are available for your state on our Prosperity Now scorecard. We'll drop the link. Joanna will drop the link here in just a second, but feel free to take a look at those profiles, examine just sort of trends on cost of living in your state, and feel free to share that data as well. Wanted to plug that, so it'll be in the chat box in just a second. Nia, I see you have a question here. Nia, if you would unmute yourself, that's probably a lot easier than me attempting to read that off. Nia, if you're speaking, you're still muted. So if you want to read your question off. I'm not sure what's going on, but I'll read it off. Nia's absent here. Does anyone have any thoughts on the Republican argument that the total rent backlog is overstated by Moody's? Are there other sources of data that articulate the real challenges that cost-burdened families are facing in the economic crisis? To respond to that argument.
I mean, I could chime in ever so carefully and quickly. First of all, I think if the Moody's data is, I think they do their best. And remember, drawing this from 50 states plus the District of Columbia and elsewhere, it is really hard to get comprehensive data because the data reporting in each of these jurisdictions is very different, not just the states, but local jurisdictions as well. So that's problematic, especially when we're talking about private landlords and private property owners when there's no requirement to report that information until they go to court, right? And they file for eviction for non-payment. So that's the challenge. But unless there's an alternative source of data that opposition to that initiative will provide, I'm not quite sure what the response is supposed to be. I will just note this, is that the moratorium needs to be strengthened and extended. It has to be packaged with rental assistance like it was in the last package. Landlords need to be made whole. We don't want them to go away and be gobbled up by big institutional investors. But let's be clear, The Economist magazine just had an article released recently this week that notes how many lives will probably have been saved by the eviction moratorium. This was a good idea. It was flawed, but it has saved lives, and it's also going to save people's housing. That's where we should be focused on. If we overextend because the Moody's data is too generous, so be it. That's my opinion for what it's worth.
Thanks, Doug. And thanks, Joanna, for linking the cost of living profiles. Feel free to click that link and take a look at your state's profile. And then lastly, I wanted to share our information for you all to stay in touch. There's the email addresses of every one of our speakers today. Feel free to reach back out. And Rachel, we would love to your comment earlier to have that introduction to the mayors and CEOs. But these are our email addresses, and someone asked it earlier, and I mentioned it earlier. This conversation was recorded and will be available on our website for future use. So we'll send that out after our final call in this series in 2 weeks. So just be on the lookout for that. So before I wrap it up, I wanted to just give pause another moment to see if anyone had any final questions, comments before I sign us off here. Hearing nothing. Well, thank you all for joining us. And like I mentioned, our final call will take place 2 weeks from today on March 9th. We'll talk about our consumer protections priorities. If you all are doing consumer protections work, please join us. The discussion will be similar to this. We'll talk about our priorities and then want to hear from you all. And then lastly, visit our Advocacy Center as well as our scorecard to check out your state's cost of living profile. So with that, thank you all for joining us, and you all have a great rest of your Tuesday, and we will see you in 2 weeks on March 9th.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.